In that moment when you're facing uncertainty, what happens? Do you react out of habit, or do you make a conscious choice? That's what this episode is about. You're listening to Pure Light, where we explore how you can believe in yourself and be happy with who you are so that you feel worthy of your craziest dreams and confident in your power to make them happen. My name is Ailey. I'm a coach, writer, and yoga and meditation teacher. This is episode 108. So in the last episode, I talked about how there's two ways that we can react to uncertainty. So one is to face it and ride the wave of excitement that comes along with it. And the other is to hesitate and let it pass you by, which is not uncommon because as human beings, we tend to focus more on what we might lose than what we can gain. So in this episode, I want to dig deeper into what happens in that moment, because it isn't necessarily a conscious choice that determines what we do. That decision could be driven by our mental and emotional habits. So I just read The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, and I want to talk about how habits work for a second. So according to the book, there are 3 pieces to the habit loop. There's a trigger or cue, so something that happens that signals to the brain that this is the time for the habit to happen, which it then does automatically. The second piece is the routine. That's what you do when the trigger happens, and this can be physical or mental or emotional. And the third piece is the reward. So that's the payoff for executing the habit. So it's the benefit that you experience as the result of it. The more you do a habit, the more automatic it becomes. So it becomes something that just happens without thinking about it. So it's kind of like the brain goes on autopilot. So if you think about brushing your teeth in the morning, for example, that's something that you probably do, but you don't really think about. It just happens. You don't think, how am I going to do this? Where am I going to do this? What am I going to do this with? What should I use? Like all those decisions are made automatically. So it just happens without any conscious deliberation. So going back to the cue for a second, or the trigger, the first step in that habit loop, there are 5 things that typically trigger a habit. So the first one is location. The second one is time. The third is emotional state. The fourth one is other people. And the fifth one is immediately preceding action. So if you think about this in the context of that decision about whether or not you act on your excitement and face uncertainty, assuming that there is a habit there, emotional state is the most likely trigger because there's a feeling associated with facing uncertainty. It's uncomfortable. There may be fear. There's definitely vulnerability because there's exposure to the possibility of failure or of the possibility of things not working out. And there's a feeling of not being in control, kind of like Alice in Wonderland falling down the hole. Someone shared that metaphor with me the other day, and I was like, oh, that's such a good way to describe that. So in the prologue in The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg talks about a woman named Lisa who was a smoker. I'll leave the story for the book, but basically she had one set of habits that included smoking and binge eating, and another set of habits that included jogging and healthy eating. And she was part of a research study where scientists were looking at patterns in the brain associated with habits. And they could see 2 different sets of patterns in her brain, one based on the old habits and one based on the new ones. So when she saw food, they could see activity in the parts of the brain associated with craving and hunger. And at the same time, they could also see activity in the parts of the brain related to self-discipline. So it's possible to have 2 different sets of habits for the same trigger. I know for myself that I've had that when it comes to facing uncertainty, because for a long time, my automatic habit was to shut it down. And I didn't even notice that that was a habit. I just noticed that in general, I felt stuck. And it was only after I had a year where it felt like everything in my life was falling apart and I started questioning everything that I noticed how much I avoided that discomfort. And I did that for a lot of reasons. I didn't like how it felt, but more than that, I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to rock the boat. I didn't want to create conflict. Like there were a whole bunch of reasons that I did not like facing uncertainty, even for things that excited me. But that year, a bunch of things happened that made me feel like I had nothing to lose. Like I failed a promotion, I ended a long-term relationship, like a lot of stuff happened. So at that point, I didn't really care if I rocked the boat or if I said something that someone else didn't like, because it felt like the boat was already being rocked and I had already like tipped over. So my old automatic pattern, the habit that I was not conscious of, was when I felt that feeling of uncertainty, the routine was to go into my head. So to try to shut down that feeling. And the payoff for that was not rocking the boat. It was keeping myself safe and keeping things as they were. When I was in that process of questioning everything, it was around the same time that I got into yoga. And I really started to notice what was going on in my mind and my body when that feeling came up. So rather than going into my head, I learned to breathe through it and stay in my body when I was faced with that discomfort of facing uncertainty. So I kept breathing and kept feeling the feeling. And there were a few payoffs that happened as a result of that. So the first one was having a choice, because when the other pattern was happening automatically, the choice would be made for me. So it's no wonder I felt stuck when I was in that other pattern. And so when I realized that I had a choice, I started doing the thing that excited me, which meant facing uncertainty instead of trying to avoid it. So courage was another payoff, because I was actually facing my fears and moving through the discomfort that comes along with that. So it was a bit of a package deal in terms of the payoff. There was choice, excitement, courage, and willingness to be with that uncomfortable feeling. And I don't think it requires a crisis to change your patterns. That certainly can be a catalyst, but so can deciding that you want to become the kind of person that makes courageous decisions. I want to share a quote from page 20 in The Power of Habit. When a habit emerges, the brain stops fully participating in decision making. It stops working so hard or diverts focus to other tasks. So unless you deliberately fight a habit, unless you find new routines, the pattern will unfold automatically. So it takes a level of really paying attention in the moment to what's happening in order to break a pattern. I know it required a lot of effort for me because I had to, in each moment, continue to choose to feel what was going on in my body and breathe through that instead of shutting down that feeling and going into my head. And it took some practice to be able to do that. But once I learned how to stay with that discomfort, it became a lot easier because it was thrilling all of a sudden to make those decisions that excited me. So if you want to change this pattern, you really need to pay attention to what happens in that moment when the uncertainty comes up and how that experience unfolds within you. Your pattern may be similar to mine. It may be something different, but it probably won't be obvious because it isn't like the habit of getting up and brushing your teeth where you can see what you're doing. And that's why in the last episode, I asked you to think about the last time you were in that excited state where you wanted to do something that required facing uncertainty. So there was desire and excitement. What did you do in that moment? Was your decision a conscious choice or an automatic pattern? Like, was it a habit? I think for all of us, life is better when we make conscious choices instead of acting out of habit in those moments. Because then you have the capacity to determine, is this the right path for me? Instead of just automatically shutting down the possibility. Only you know what's right for you. If you're acting out of habit in that moment, and your habit is to avoid the uncertainty, you'll continue to perpetuate your life being exactly the way that it is right now. In the book, The Third Door, Alex Banayan said, "Nobody achieves a dream in the comfort of certainty." And that book is actually a great example of Alex making those hard choices to take the path that excites him. It's a great book. I'll include a link to it in the show notes, which you can find at purelightpodcast.com. And if you enjoyed this, I would also highly recommend subscribing to Pure Light wherever you listen to podcasts, because there's more to come on this. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, may you be guided by your light.